Eggleston House. This is, again, as we've talked about, up in the center district. The farmers had great farms outside of town, and as they grew elderly and unable to care for the farms, they would pass them on to their children. They would then move into town and build houses in town and spend the rest of their life in the centers of town. So let's go ahead and start. The first major brick structure built in Aurora since the Eggleston House up on Eggleston Road, which was built in the 1830s. So we didn't have much brick building other than for chimneys and things. But Frank Treat, this is the third establishment on this site that served as a store. The original one was opened by an Ebenezer Sheldon, not the settler Ebenezer, but his grandson, about 1840. It was a thriving operation. He sold it. Later it was not struck by lightning, but it burned down, and a house was moved from down there up here that became the second shop that was here. Frank Treat bought the land, and they didn't want, as we've talked about in the past, the houses in this town moved around just like they were on wheels, because they did not like to just tear down and do away with. They did reuse of them constantly. So the house that was moved from there was moved up here and ended up the little red house over here, where we're going to end up the whole day at the burn. When Frank Treat came from a very comfortable farming family. The Treat home was up on Route 42, right about where Barrington is, just beyond where the water tower is. And it was abandoned, and about maybe 35 or 40 years ago, the city of Aurora, in those days, this was before historic preservation really took hold, the fire department used it for fire practice and burned it down. However, George Hettinger was smart enough to have saved the beautiful Adams front door, which is the focal point of the Historical Society today. And that came from the Amos Treat house, which was the grandfather of the man that built this fine brick building. One side was a general store. The other side served as a area where farmers brought milk, farmers brought feed. There was a feed storage area, and there was a railroad siding that ran right up to the back of the building, so that the cars could be loaded right into the storefront itself. There was at one time a parapet up across the top, but that is gone with years. But we're just very happy to see that one of our old buildings has been very well cared for, and see it still being used as a commercial building today. Now, the barn is probably, again, about 1910, 1915. It was an ice house. It was an ice house for this, and we're, again, happy to see it being maintained, because a few years ago we were very concerned that it might just crumble to pieces, but they now have done some work on it, and they are preserving that too. This, of course, the whole district now, the whole area here is the historic district, and it is under the protection of the Aurora Landmark Commission. About 1910-15, Frank Treat had a little competition come to town, and that was in the form of a man by the name of Albert Bentley Hurd, who was a descendant of the early families of town, and he decided he'd put up a little competition across the street. His shop was more, however, for the sale of stoves and farm machinery, as opposed to this being more of a general store. After Treat died, the store became a drugstore, and many, again, residents that have been here for 30 plus years can remember when Rick Mattmuller's drugstore was in this building. Next door to the Hurd shop was the Aurora House. This was a hotel for the Station District. The center had a hotel, which is now Mario's, this was the hotel for the station district, and most of the pictures you see in either Aurora from the Founding to the Flood book or any of the other early books put out by the Historical Society, there are pictures of this house, and it had a porch that went all the way across the front, so it hardly is recognizable today. But it stands. It's been here again since about the turn of the century, and was noted for its fine food, and a lot of people would get on the train, come out, and those that didn't stop at Jogga Lake, they would come out to Aurora, have their Sunday lunches here, and then get back on the train and go into town. At one point, there were as many, I believe, as 8 trains that came through here, picking up passengers a day.
Just gotta remember not to get off.
The hotel, Gingerbread Hill, built in 1868 by Charles Russell. Charlie Russell was a Civil War veteran, moved to Aurora after the Civil War, and became a store owner. He was the interim store owner of what is now what was the Frank Treat store. He married Sylvia Pease, an early Aurora family connected with the Peases and the Herds and the Sheldons, again, married into the early families. His brother, Wilson Russell, also a Civil War veteran, came to town also. Wilson married the daughter of the Milling family, and that's not a last name, it was the Howard family, and we'll talk about him when we go across the street. But this should have maybe at one time been called Russellville, because the Russells were the movers and shakers down here in the 1860s up through the turn of the century. And this was Charlie Russell's house. It was he that moved the house that is now the Burns house up the hill to become the shop, and then finally across the street. It was he who owned the hotel. It was he who built the little house that's a catty corner across here, where the first telephone exchange in the city of Aurora was first located. And the story of that is exciting because they sort of had a ersatz one. They ran wires from fence post to fence post to fence post to fence post, and of course it was just a single line, and the 2 maiden sisters, one a school teacher and one a maiden lady that just was at home, knew everything that was going on in town, of course, because everything came through their house with open wires, and they could listen in on everything, so that early telephone system was kind of interesting.
Hi, Betsy.
Hi, Betsy.
You want to join us?
The house is Gothic, pure Gothic revival country. One of the really beautiful houses in Aurora, and is being obviously very well maintained, and we're so proud that it has been maintained this way for so long. But it shows a very high style of person, because that's what Charlie Russell was. And we have some wonderful photographs taken again in the late, maybe 1890s, of this whole property, and it has not changed a great deal, as a matter of fact. So let's go on now on down. The Martin Eggleston house, and this is one of the purest quote-unquote houses that we have left in the town. Not a great deal has been done to this house from the time it was built, probably in the early 1830s. The sides, some of the windows on the sides have been changed, but it is typical of what the common, ordinary citizen in Aurora would have built for himself. And if you go around and look beyond porches that have been added around town and things like that, you will see a lot of houses that have this same basic design. This was the house that everybody had the plans for. And this one, however, has been very, very, very much let alone, and it's so great that it has. Martin Eggleston was the last of a family of 7 boys and girls that came out with their father from Middlefield, Massachusetts. And he was the last of the family to come. He arrived around 1812 and probably put up some sort of a log house first, and then later, when he got himself established, ended up building this. It's very difficult to exactly date these houses because unless there was a diary kept. This is a house that was built by the Hurd brothers, Elisha and Frank. Their father, Hobson Hurd, I think many of you have been on the talk about Hobson Hurd. He was the storekeeper and the financier of this town from his settlement days in 1813 up until his death in the late 1860s. And because of his miserly ways and his foreclosing on so many of the people he had lent money to, he owned probably 3/4 of the town at the time of his death. But this was one of the houses that his sons, Elisha and Frank, built for their workers. They ran part of the mill down here, and this was one of the mill keeper's house. And they built a very fine Gothic house for them. There had been a house here before this that burned, but this one dates to the 1870s. It didn't look like this originally. Back about 10 years ago, when a great deal of work was being done on this house, we got into the second floor, and they were really working on it in earnest. And we found that the original house, the whole positioning of it was north-south. The little part to the left of the house is the old part of the house. And the ridgepole ran that direction, and they completely changed the ridgepole. And when we got into the basement, the foundations in the basement show the evidence of probably what was a cooking fireplace and a large, what would have been in a cabin, or again, an earlier house than most of these others. And it's the famous flood of 1913. I say famous flood for Aurora. Eliakim Baldwin's mill was on the other side of the river, right down at the riverbed. The Bill Dam and Race had been built by Chauncey Eggleston and Ebenezer Sheldon early on. They seeing also the commercial possibilities of the water power coming through here. On that side of the road, down in the valley here, there were 3 different buildings of commercial value. There was a shoemaker, a chair maker's shop, and a tannery. And when we cross the street, we'll look more at the tannery area. On this side, there was a factory over on this side, right at the foot of the hill, supposedly where they made violins. That was one of the people there that was instrumental in that. There were the Preston brothers, and then also Joseph Skinner, who was the noted violinist and person in great demand to play at parties and things. Coming from Mandaway over to Aurora, the two towns were very, very interconnected by the same settlers from the same area in Connecticut. The elders come into town, Edward and Samuel. They came and bought out Eliakim Baldwin. They ran the mill. They turned the mill into, instead of a grinding mill, they turned it into a mill for a fulling mill, where people would bring in cloth or sheep wool, and that they would prepare it then for market. So it was constantly in use there, and Eliakim Baldwin would take a tree, or they would bring them into the sawmill, and he would then run it through the saw, and as you made a square out of a tree, those pieces that were cut off were called slabs.
I don't know who lives here. This gentleman. Oh.
No.
Oh.
When you are up there, you can hardly see. Early on, the tannery was in this area, and tanning hides, you needed great vats of water. And what they would do, they did not run it out of the river. There were streams and springs up in these hills, and they built troughs, wooden troughs on great huge legs, and troughed the water down into the vats for the tanning. And of course, what was the original business out here was dairy. You have cows, the cows die, you have hides, and you take them to the tannery. Right next door was the shoemaker and the bootmaker. This is the symbiotic relationship of all of these various things in the early days. But it's said that the children in the winter would relish when the winter came, that these troughs would freeze, and they'd use them for slides and slide down them once they froze. But I'm afraid, not having sandpaper, that might have been a little bit dangerous. But down on this side was the Hurd cheese factory, probably up at the end beyond the turn where what you can see is mowed, is where the Hurd cheese factory was. And Mrs. Frank Hurd, this is one of the other articles that appeared after the flood, was that the railroad company was sued by Mrs. Hurd for the loss of the buildings in the cheese factory. She was blaming, obviously, the railroad company for not maintaining that trestle correctly. As I say, and stores were not huge buildings in the middle 19th century. They were generally 1 or 2 rooms and fairly small by modern standards. So you could have 3 buildings right here working as stores side by side. We have, if any of you have the Aurora from the Founding to the Flood book, and I'm not doing a plug for it really, but in the back are 3 very finely written monographs. One is about this area right here, and it was written by a man by the name of Bradley Hawkins, and he was born in a house that stood probably where those trees are right there. And he wrote this just before the turn of the century. He was correcting some people, as a matter of fact, that had written some history before, and he said, no, this wasn't exactly right. I'll tell it to you the way it really was. And it's a wonderfully, wonderfully detailed history of where we're standing. And I commend it to you. It's wonderfully written, very flowery Victorian language, but again, it really gives you a true picture of what life was right here where we're standing today. The original bridge, or the first metal bridge, I can't say the original bridge, but the first metal bridge came across at an angle here rather than straight the way it does now. It angled to go across the stream in a different way. And in the early pictures, you can see that very, very plainly. The road came down, took a little turn to the right, then it crossed the bridge, and then it turned. It had a little zigzag in it. The river, even today, you can see is running pretty fast. Slab City. Now I'm going to tell you why it became known as Howardville. The original purchaser of this piece of property on the west side of the river was a man by the name of Septimus Witter. He too was a miller, obviously drawn to the water power, and he put up a sawmill back in here, further back of that fence right there, right on the river. The river comes back, takes a large bow to the west right there, and then goes on, maybe down to about where the railroad is, and then it makes another turn north. Witter sold the house to and the mill to a man by the name of Freeman Howard. Freeman Howard was Aurora's premier miller. He had this mill, He eventually built a second mill across the river. That was this was a grist mill, that was a sawmill. He then went up and saw the possibilities up at Centerville, which is up on Crackle Road, and he built a mill up there. And there's a wonderful story of his mill up there burning, which was a great tragedy to the town. And we have a document in the Historical Society files where the townspeople got together and offered it 2 days' labor or 5 sheepskins and things like that in order to come and help Freeman Howard rebuild that mill. And the story of when he rebuilt the mill up at Centerville, and it was a great tall mill, that he climbed up to the top beam of this mill with the river down at the bottom and took a jug of whiskey and quaffed it off and then dropped the jug down and to break on the bottom of the rocks on the bottom. I don't know how true that is, but that's the story that went around. But he had a son, Chester, who inherited all the property, and Chester didn't like the old common house that they lived in here. So he contracted, evidently he'd gone to western New York State on a trip or something, and he happened to see a style of house very unusual in Ohio, but very often found in western New York State, and that's the cobblestone type of house. This is probably the best known house in the city of Aurora. It's in every book on Ohio architecture that has been published to date. It's just we are so fortunate to have it. The lintels and the lintels on the windows and on the doors, etc., are iron. The walls are something like 13 inches thick, and it has been well maintained through the years, and it's obviously still in loving hands, thank goodness. The cobblestones on the front are extended. In other words, you can see the curvatures on them. On the back here, they're just flat and set in. But this was the Chester Howard house, and it was lived in. Chester Howard's daughter married Wilson Russell, who was Charlie Russell's brother from up in Geauga County, came down here, and it was lived in well into the 1900s by descendants of the family. Then it had been sold out, but again, to people that loved it and have cared for it greatly. And we are so pleased to have this. This house is on the National Register of Historic Places, and also the HABS, the Historic American Building Survey that was done in the 1930s to put architects to work. They went around the country drawing fine representative architectural houses. This is one of them from Aurora. I think Aurora had 4 that were done, this being one of them and probably the most famous. Decorations at the peak are rotting and
oh, those.
1852, the front of the house, we go around the front as we're leaving and up in the purposes. And
What do you mean by whey sugar?
W-H-E-Y, the
leftover from
curds and whey.
Oh, okay.
And these boilers were created out somewhere and brought out here, and it did not work, and the operation went bust. But and they were split apart, and they were used as water to make a mold. Many of the cobblestone houses in western New York State. He was evidently, Ken says that he's had visitors come in who are descendants of M. Smith. He made himself famous.
If I owned the house, I wouldn't have gone.
That's right. And they, Seabury Ford, who was one of our real, again, monuments around town, great man, and I have many pleasant hours sitting and talking to him and interviewing him and writing down. That's where a lot of the stories come from, because he lived here all his life. And he tells a story, and he proves it with a deed. The deed to that land deeds the property, and the house and the outhouse, half of the outhouse. The outhouse sat right on the property line. Half of it was in the next person's piece of property, and there were 2 doors, and it was a 2-holer. So, but it needed half of the outhouse.
How to meet your neighbor?
That's exactly right.
Back to back, huh?
And I was telling them about the house where we're sitting. This house has been in 3 different locations in this area. This is the 3rd, and it was where Johnny McDonald grew up as a boy.
And the house next door was the first constable lived there.
Was that Sam Miller? Sam Miller.
And he lived right over there. Yeah.
Well, then you're home.
That's right. Well, I lived here over 60 years ago, in this house.
Oh, did you, Jane? I didn't know that.
We rented from Johnny McDonald
Okay.
over 60 years ago. We lived downstairs, of course, and then my aunt and uncle lived upstairs. So I don't know when it became a 2-family house. It's been built in sections. It's all 3 or 4 sections.
4 seconds.
2 years ago, we made it back into it.
The fellow talking about
Two-family
three.
house. Then it was
Spent
a
a lifetime
one-family,
using
then
the
one
lumber
came
company. And it sat back here, and Treek spent a lifetime selling his property off. We've spent a lifetime buying it all.
Buying it all back.
So we have about 30+ acres.
back there, over the hill.
And the biggest claim to fame there is, when as a kid, when I came out from Cleveland, we went swimming down here in the river, and that used to be BAB. I don't know if you know what BAB stands for, but we'll stop right there. Okay, so we bought BAB, and I thought to myself, how many people get an opportunity to do this? And so we've had a lot of fun. Curtis is, Mitchell's a little guy. He's one that makes a little noise. He's autistic and
But he's
great
happy.
kid.
That's
And he's
So you
happy.
lost to a company.
He likes
We're
company.
very excited that you're all
And
here.
Curtis is his brother. Curtis is around here somewhere. And so we spend a lot of time down in the woods.
Interestingly enough, back years ago, Seabury Ford talked to the Historical Society, and one of our other charter members, a lady that's now in a nursing home out in Elyria, who spent her summers out here, came and she said, "I've come just to keep Seabury Ford from telling stories about watching us girls do what you did down in the river down here at the swimming hole." So even it wasn't limited to the boys; it was the girls also evidently slipped away and did a little skinny dipping in the river.
Apparently this was all, they had a lot of orchards. You didn't have the wooded area. And there's a lot of old orchards, apple trees in through here. And this building that across from, I don't know if you checked that, the building next to Brown's old store there, that building used to sit down on a pond that we have. And they used to call it Slaughter Lake. On each pond, but they called it, they made ice there.
It was a nice house.
They had an ice house, and then they also apparently butchered the meat.
I didn't know that they had moved that. They had moved up here. That I didn't know. It's nice to see that they're finally
Well,
doing some work on
Oh,
it.
yeah, doing some work.
So there used to be a lot of bottles found along the track.
On the
down
track,
here.
I had told you that prior to the coming of the railroads, most of the settlers were all New England origins. Once the railroads came through,